Sony PlayStation vs Sega Saturn, the biggest console war of the 90s. In today's video, we are going to compare the general specs of each respective console and talk a little bit about how they were marketed. As far as comparing which console had better games is a separate video for the future. That said, let's jump into it. First, let's do a brief history of each system to catch you up. The PlayStation's origins can trace all the way back to 1988 when Sony and Nintendo were collaborating on a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo called the Nintendo PlayStation. Weird name, right? Anyway, the plan fell massively after Nintendo parted ways with Sony and partnered with Philips instead because Nintendo believed that Sony didn't know anything about the gaming industry. At the Consumer Electronics Show in 1991, Sony unveiled the Nintendo PlayStation prototype. That same day was when Nintendo announced they were partnering with Philips. This motivated Ken Kutaragi, the father of the PlayStation, to further develop the PlayStation to beat Nintendo. By 1994, the PlayStation 1, then known as the PlayStation X, or PSX as most people call it, was released in Japan and it only played CD-ROM games instead of cartridges. This proved to be the best move Sony has ever done, and it led to the PlayStation being the best-selling console of the decade. The console would also be released in the US on September 9, 1995 with over 100,000 pre-sold units by the launch day. By the end of 2003, it made history by becoming the first video game console to sell over 100 million units around the world. Next up, the Sega Saturn. With the success of the Genesis, Sega wanted to make a system that focused on replicating their famous 3D arcade titles. Sega had experienced success in the arcade business for a while, and some of their most famous titles were Virtua Fighter, Virtua Racing, and Daytona USA. Sega tried this when they made the Sega CD and the Sega 32X, which were add-ons for the Genesis. They were massive commercial failures as they were seen as petty attempts to keep the Genesis alive in contrast with its rival, the Super Nintendo. Speaking of the 32X, Sega was originally going to make a system called the Sega Neptune. This console was set to be a standalone 32X system, but it was scrapped. Instead, Sega wanted to go for a more expensive route into the 32-bit market, and that would be the invention of the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn was released in Japan on November 22, 1994, and it was very successful there. However, in the US, there were a ton of problems. In March 1995, Tom Klinsky, the CEO of Sega of America at the time, announced that the Saturn would be released on September 2, 1995, dubbed Saturn Day. However, Sega of Japan urged Sega of America to release the console early to gain an advantage over the Sony PlayStation. At the first ever E3 event on May 11, 1995, Klinsky gave a presentation for the Saturn and revealed that the release price was $399, $449 if it included a bundled copy of the first Virtua Fighter. Klinsky also said that Sega has shipped 30,000 units to stores like Toys R Us and Babbage's for immediate release. This announcement heavily upset retailers who were not told ahead of time of the surprise release. Sega rushing the release of the Saturn heavily backfired on them, as on the same day at E3 during the presentation of the PlayStation, Steve Race, the president of Sony Computer Entertainment of America, took the stage where he delivered the famous $2.99 speech.
$2.99.
The idea of the PlayStation being sold for $100 less than that of the Saturn was met with great applause from everyone in attendance at the presentation. The PlayStation also had 9 launch titles at release, whereas the Saturn had only 6, due to most third-party developers having their games released around the original launch date of the Saturn. Similar to Sega, Sony partnered with Namco, who at the time were known for having the Daytona USA alternative, Ridge Racer. This game was heavily acclaimed by critics and fans who cite it as contributing to the early success of the PlayStation. On Sega Saturn, there was the aforementioned Daytona USA, which, while it is a fun game, is considered inferior to its arcade counterpart. Even though the Namco System 11 arcade board is technically inferior to Sega's Model 2 arcade board, the Namco System 11 was less expensive, making it all the more attractive for smaller arcades. In certain aspects, the Sega Saturn is more powerful than the Sony PlayStation. The Saturn has more computational power and faster pixel drawing. The PlayStation can only draw pixels through its polygon engine, whereas the Saturn can draw pixels directly with its processors, giving it more programming flexibility. The Saturn is also capable of computing fixed-pointed operations faster than the PlayStation's GTE. GTE, or Geometry Transform Engine, is a coprocessor that resides in the main CPU processor, giving it additional vector math instructions used for 3D graphics, lighting, geometry, polygon, and coordinate transformations. In this case, the Saturn can calculate 3D geometry faster than the PlayStation. In regards to polygon rendering fill rate, both systems have similar performances in their GPUs. Although both systems use garage shading, games like Ridge Racer Type 4 on the PlayStation show this, the Saturn's VDP-1 uses additive garage shading as opposed to the PlayStation's GPU, which uses multiplicative garage shading, which impacts the fill rates. The bottom line is, the Sega Saturn really is more powerful than the PlayStation graphically. However, later models of the PlayStation proved far superior. The new PlayStation model replaced the VRAM with a new SG-RAM, a chip made by NEC, the company responsible for the TurboGrafx-16. The SG-RAM allowed faster memory access because of its lower latency. Regardless of what you may think which console is better, the fact of the matter is that the Saturn is more powerful than the PlayStation. In another video, which will be opinion-based, we'll discuss the console design, the controllers, and the games. This video was to only give you an insight on the true facts about the Sega Saturn and the Sony PlayStation. As I said before, graphically, the Saturn is more powerful than the PlayStation. However, in terms of marketing, you can obviously tell that the Sony PlayStation was light years ahead of the Sega Saturn, even with the Sega Saturn being released months before the PlayStation even saw its release. I hope you guys enjoyed this video essay of mine. If you guys did, make sure you hit that subscribe button for more videos like this. And in another video, we are going to look at the console design, the controllers, and the games for each system, which will be opinion-based. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. This is your friendly neighborhood reptile, signing off.